College football nerds, we are obviously going to talk about Florida and Georgia this week, and we got models. So before we get into models, before we get into talking, y'all hit that like, hit that subscribe, but most importantly, as we tell you every week, we need your score prediction so we can mix it up with you in the comments. So let us know what you think the score is going to be, and we'll tell you why you're wrong. Okay, Josh, this game is really, really important in the SEC East race this year. Georgia's already got a loss. Unfortunately, they drew Alabama this year, so it's not entirely fair to compare win-loss records at this point. But I think it's important to look at style of play and who they played, because that's what we do. Some of it's hypothetical, I understand. But one of the things that we were talking about, we saw what Alabama's offense was able to do to Georgia. I think it's pretty clear that that's an elite offense, possibly the best in the country, maybe top 5 in the last decade, I think. Especially they played them, remember, with Jalen Waddle. So Georgia's about to face another top-tier offense. And we've held that Florida's offense is top tier since we saw them really have their coming out party against LSU last year. But one thing we noticed, and what I want you to talk about to get us started, is if you look at Florida's opponents this year, none of them are good defensive opponents. So do we know enough about this Florida's offense to make a judgment, or is there some concern because they haven't played anybody of note defensively?
We often say that a passing game is effective at 7.5 yards per attempt, and a passing game is very effective at 8.5 or higher. For Florida's opponents in pass defense, they've given up 7.9 yards per attempt. That's South Carolina. A&M's given up 8.5 yards per attempt. Missouri's given up 8.6 yards per attempt, and Ole Miss, being Ole Miss, has given up 9.1 yards per attempt. None of those are quite as bad as LSU, who's dead last at 10, but that's a different matter entirely. The problem, though, is those are all in the bottom half of the SEC. 8, 9, 10, and 12th in the conference in pass defense and yards per attempt allowed. None of them are good. And all those teams are allowing, on average, their opponents to be successful in the passing game. If you compare that to what Georgia's faced, and people are very critical of Stetson Bennett, but let's be realistic. Kentucky has allowed 6.5 yards per attempt. Alabama has allowed 6.9 yards per attempt. Arkansas has allowed 6.1 yards per attempt. So between these two teams, Georgia has faced the first, third, fourth, and sixth ranked defense. Auburn's the last one at 7.2. And the others face the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 12th. Completely opposite spectrums. And I think it's interesting going into this that you really have to realize Florida has played fairly effective offenses, maybe on the upper end of it, not having played Alabama, but really poor defenses. Georgia has played the upper tier of the conference defensively already. I mean, they've already gone through it. Offensively, it's much more of a mixed bag. Really, Alabama is the only good offense in that group. So you kind of have, everybody looks at the contrasting styles, right? Of Florida being the great offense and Georgia being the great defense. I think you have to bear in mind that Florida has only played bad defense and Georgia has mostly only played bad offense. So, going into it, I will say in terms of breakpoints, in terms of how things affect opposing offenses, we don't know how Florida is going to really respond at all to a team that can effectively stop the pass. We have some idea how Georgia is going to do against an elite offense because at least they played Alabama. We don't really have any calibration point for Florida.
And I want to talk about Georgia's offense a little bit, and maybe I can wax poetic on that. We're both higher on that offense than I think a lot of people are. But real quick, I want to quickly turn it around back to you and have you also address this other thing. We saw this with Alabama for a couple of years when Tua was there, and we've seen it other places, Ohio State and obviously Clemson, where people would trash Tua, trash Alabama in saying, yeah, but they're playing a bunch of crappy teams, and Tua can just lob it up to whomever at wide receiver, and they can put up points. We maintained that it was still pretty obvious that these were elite offenses, even against subpar competition. Are we in a situation with Florida where we can tell, even against subpar competition, that offense is for real?
I have more confidence in it due to the way it operates. So The great example of this is the 2018 Alabama-Clemson game. That example actually goes both ways because both of those teams hadn't really been challenged great against good competition. I mean, Tua struggled in the 2018 championship against Georgia, but everybody kind of threw that out due to his injury going into the game and in the game. So you didn't really know what that meant. But I think people also forget Clemson was really questioned because Clemson hadn't been challenged by a good defense. And what we saw was that Clemson's offense totally translated. They were as good or better against Notre Dame and Alabama than they had been to that point. Alabama's offense just stalled. The same thing they did against Georgia, they did against Clemson. The thing that gives me more confidence in Florida in this game is I like a quarterback that's able to distribute the ball efficiently than I like an offense that is based off an explosiveness. Now, Clemson was a little bit of a weird thing because their translation was due almost entirely to the vertical passing game. That was a weird situation with the receivers they had, the quarterback, and the type of throws they were able to make. There's also some things to be said about Alabama's defensive injuries, but I think Alabama stalled because they were all about the big play. They were the RPO-based shot play offenses. RPO offenses, a lot like we've talked about for years with zone read spread offenses in the run game, I think elite defenses can take away that RPO. They can sink the linebackers and still deal with the run, and it kind of breaks the scheme. But when you have a guy like Joe Burrow last year, when you have a guy like Mac Jones has been this year, and I think Kyle Trask, I'm not sure if he's quite as good as those two, or considering all the weapons around him, he's similar though, in that he runs the offense by finding the right guy, making the throw consistently, and running the offense at a high level. In this new modern RPO spread scheme, if you've got a guy like that isn't just pure arm talent hitting this one RPO concept over and over, but is able to hit the check down efficiently, there's no way to guard those RPO concepts and not leave somebody open somewhere. And what we saw from Burrow was, you took away the RPO throw to Chase, and then he would hit Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who would get 12 yards out of the backfield. And that's what broke teams. I think we see a little bit of that from Florida. I don't know that it's not 2019 LSU. I'm sorry, it's just not. But it's still very, very good. And I think they're going to get theirs even against Georgia. So the one thing I'll turn it around to you and ask, when you look at Georgia and you look at Florida, my concern for Florida is, how they do defensively. I mean, they just stopped Missouri pretty cold, gave up 17 points, but they lost to Texas A&M in an absolute shootout. Those two offenses on paper, I'm not sure how different they really are statistically, but I think in terms of actual production and efficiency, they're pretty far apart. I think this game is going to really be decided by how many points Georgia can score. And do you think Georgia is more similar to Texas A&M offensively, or are they more similar to the Missouri offense that Florida was just able to stop?
I think they're somewhere in between. And Georgia fans are probably they're in two camps right now. Some of them really want to move on from Bennett because they know down in their core of their heart they need an elite quarterback, or someone that's a little more. I don't know what else to say, but a little more than Bennett to win a national championship. I don't necessarily know that you need that to beat Florida this year. And that's no offense to Florida. I just think that Florida's defense does have some holes in it. Bennett is a better quarterback than he's being given credit nationally. He had a better game against Alabama, other than the turnovers, than is being given credit. One of the reasons I think that, Georgia scored 24 first half points in that game. They probably score 33 to 35 if they're not having to do things that took them out of their scheme, because Alabama was rolling up a lot of points. And people are going to point to this Kentucky game, this 14-3 Kentucky game, and say, well, you only put up 14 points against Kentucky. But if you watch that game, you saw the frustration that is playing a team like Kentucky, where they get 3 yards of play. They never get 30 yards, but they never lose 7 yards. So they get 3 on first, 3 on second, 3 or 4 on third, and they do just enough to keep your offense off the field. And I think that's proven out. I think we talked about this before we started recording, that Georgia only had like 58 plays. And when that game was still in question, Like they were in the 30-ish play range. So Georgia's offense is sneaky good, and the thing that they can do that a lot of teams aren't doing well right now, including Florida, is run the ball. And that is something that I think is pretty important when you're playing a team like Florida, especially a team that can score a lot of points. At some point, you need to be able to sustain drives and not just match touchdown for touchdown with shot plays. So I think there's some stuff that will bear out in the numbers with this. So, segue alert, why don't you get us into the model and we'll go from there.
First time we've run the model this year. We'll see if it's worth a flip in the COVID era. I'll say we usually say bare minimum you need 4 games. And Florida has only played 4 games this year. So this is really the earliest we were comfortable running the model. The first thing we look at in the model is how your team has done against your opponents versus how your opponents did against everyone else. In other words, your relative statistics to opponents. And really, since it's the first time we run the model, I'll sort of reiterate this point. The model here is based off an idea that your per play averages and your statistics against given teams are indicators of your own success, but they're really indicators when you compare against, how did your offense do against Texas A&M versus how everybody else's did. And then we look at, when you had given levels of success in a game, how did that translate into scoring production? So some teams get a lot of points due to special teams. Some teams are a lot more efficient with their yardage than others. And teams have different curves. A lot of teams have what we call a stall point, where if you don't get above a certain threshold, you stop scoring. And then certain teams have breakaway points, where when you cross a certain threshold, you just can't stop them. And their scoring will be as high as they want it to be. One of the intermediary statistics we generate is percentage of opponent averages allowed. In other words, not just how good is Florida or Georgia's defense statistically, but how good are they compared to their opponents. And the first thing I'll note, Florida and Georgia, as I said, they've faced pretty different levels of offenses. In general, Florida's opponents are about a half yard per carry better and about a half yard per attempt better. Due to that difference, the defensive statistics are slanted Georgia's way, but maybe not quite as severe as people think. Florida's holding teams to 85% of their average on the ground and 95% of their average on the pass. Those numbers I would normally say are very mediocre. That's not including the fact that we have conference-only play, so I would say 100% now is totally average, where normally I say it's more like 90 to 95%. There's no garbage time cupcake stats thrown in here. Georgia's statistics are 61% against the ground and 83% against the pass. Georgia is twice as good, I would say, against the run as Florida, but Florida is not bad. They're actually pretty good, slightly above average. Florida is right about average against the pass. Georgia, again, probably 3 times as good. It's 18% drop-off versus Florida's only a 5% drop-off. The one thing I want to point out, and this comes out of our discussion with Alabama and Georgia, when you reduce a team, like in their passing game, you don't reduce them nearly as much as I think people sometimes expect. The run you can stop. Georgia holds teams to 60% of their rushing averages. The pass game, you really can't, and that's why a good quarterback really, can save the day for you. I'm guessing Georgia's probably, if they're not the best pass defensive percentage, they're going to be close to it, and it's only 83%. An 18% in opponent passing reduction is about as good as you can hope to achieve. We often say that we almost never see anything below 75%, and that, again, is including teams that shut down lesser competition. They're being compared to the normal MAC opponents rather than as only being compared to SEC teams. The end result of that entire discussion is you have a Florida offense that's expected to outgain Georgia. Florida's expected to get 5.9 yards per play. Georgia's only expected to get 5.1. Now, Florida's run game is supposed to be non-existent here, under 3 yards per carry. Georgia is not supposed to be overly effective, about 3.5 yards per carry. The difference is really coming down to how good the respective passing games are overall. Florida is expected to have 8.1 yards per attempt. Georgia, 6.9. I said earlier, 7.5 yards per attempt is the competency rating. So Georgia is not being competent in the passing game. Florida is being more than competent in the passing game. That's enough to make Florida's offense a lot more effective than Georgia's. And that's the other interesting thing I'll say is Florida is a more pass-oriented team. Georgia is a far more run-oriented team. So Georgia is skewing to the run game that's only getting you 3.5 yards per carry. Because of that and because of the run-pass balance, the model favors Florida. very, very slightly. 33 to 33 prediction, but I'll say you get the decimal points. It's actually 33.1 Florida, 32.6 Georgia. So it has Florida by a half a point here. I'll reiterate for everyone that hasn't followed us before, it's a neutral model. I don't touch it every year. The model figures out what it thinks is important to each team based off your past results. And so in the model's eyes, based purely on how you've done to this point, it thinks that Florida is a team that should win this game. But, in a 50-50 battle.
Yeah, I mean, look, we picked Florida this summer to win the East, and some of that was based on schedule. With Alabama, Georgia drawing Alabama and Florida not. And we were not high on LSU, so we didn't think that was a fair trade-off. But it really comes down to a lot this game, and the model for me, it's tough. Like, I was skeptical that we would get anything worth talking about out of the model, given that it is the era of COVID and Florida hasn't played that many games. But I'm not surprised by it. I'm going to go ahead and give my prediction here. I think Georgia gets their 33, but I don't think Florida does. And I'm going to pick Georgia 33, Florida 29, with the caveat that, look, I could be completely wrong on this. I would have picked LSU last week to beat Auburn, so that's how wrong I could be on this. I think Georgia's offense is better than people are giving them credit, and I think their defense is still the best in the country. And I'm going to go on a mini rant here, if you'll spare me the time. Everybody was quick to just light a flamethrower on that Georgia defense after Alabama scored 41. People don't understand in the modern era of the context of the modern era of football. Elite plus offenses are going to get theirs regardless. And we've seen this in national championship games with Alabama and Clemson in the past few years. It's going to happen even against elite defenses. People don't understand how well Georgia played defensively in that game. They just see the final score and the final yardage. And I think Florida has a very good offense. I think even though the model doesn't show it, and you can throw out that number in a second, I think if Florida is 15 to 20% as good as Alabama, their points fall off pretty dramatically. I think that little bit of difference, that if you're a little bit slower or you're a little bit scheme, off, you're just not quite as good, the drop-off is severe. I still think Florida gets 29 points here. I don't think it's enough to win, but if Florida wins this game, even if they win it big, it would not surprise me at all. This game is a total toss-up in my mind. Tell me what you think.
Going into this preview, I was expecting to pick Florida, truth be told. And I'm kind of drawing an audible. I'm going to pick Georgia 31 to 24, and I'll tell you why. When I started to dig into the numbers, I realized Florida's opponents are all pretty bad against the pass, frankly. And notably, all of Florida's opponents have major deficiencies at corner. They also don't have great pass rushes. And it's the pass rush question combined with the corner question that I think could kind of break this a little bit, because I don't have a lot of confidence in Florida's offensive line. I think they're solid. I don't think they're great. And I think Georgia is going to be able to run the ball well enough to move the ball and score on a Florida defense that's been really inconsistent. I don't think Florida is going to be able to generate pressure on Bennett, which means he's going to be able to get outside the pocket and throw enough to keep Georgia efficient. And I think Georgia is going to be very disruptive at the line of scrimmage. And the problem with Georgia with Alabama is Alabama's got one of, if not the best offensive line in the country this year. Georgia could still got pressure on Mac Jones, but not enough. And Alabama had enough time to hit their double moves and whatnot. And that's where the receiver talent takes over. I don't think Florida's going to have time to leverage Tony and Pitts and all those guys the way they want to. And I also think it's a little scary that Florida hasn't faced anything that shows what it looks like when that happens. We talked about how that Clemson game worked out and whatnot. There's another side to it, which is my model is based off how you did in those games and where your breaking point was. There's no way the model has any idea what happens when Florida faces an elite defense. And the one thing that typically breaks a team offensively is when the line gets beat. It's what happened to Auburn when they played Georgia. The offensive and defensive lines for Auburn were overmatched, and that breaks everything. I think that's what probably sort of happens here. I think Florida still moves the ball well enough to score in the 20s, but I was originally going to pick Florida by a field goal, and I'm going to flip it. I think Georgia wins 31-24. And if you'll excuse one last little part of this rant, I do agree with you. I think people are missing how good Bennett actually is. Is he the greatest quarterback ever? No. Does he have elite pro level talent? No. But he knows how to run the offense well, and he lets you run pretty much the entire playbook that you want to run. He can't make some throws on the field, but he's very effective, and he finds the open man, and he runs it efficiently, and you can't take that for granted. And I'll get off my soapbox, but people are way too high on JT Daniels that I was not high on coming out of USC, because I think Bennett is a far more efficient quarterback than Daniels. And when you pair that with a very effective run game, outside an opponent that's going to score 45, there are not many teams in the country, maybe 3 to 5 teams in the country, that are going to be able to score enough points on Georgia to keep pace with Georgia's basic run plus efficient passing attack.
And you said Alabama. I agree. I think Alabama has the best offensive line in the country. Georgia might have the second best. I don't think that's wild to say, even though I think that there was some question marks, especially after that Arkansas game, who they were. They really have impressed me so far this year. We do this a lot, and I want to do it again in terms of discussing if Florida wins the game and not Georgia, what is going to be the reason why. And I'll give you my reason why. And it was from our discussion ahead of this little preview where we were looking at some numbers, and I'm going to go off my memory. I don't know if this is exact, but I think it was Florida held Bazelak to like 5.2 yards per attempt and Larry Roundtree to 2.8 yards per rush. Those numbers are really impressive for Florida's defense, given what that Missouri offense, and especially those two players, have done so far this year. Roundtree is as good a back as anything on Georgia's roster right now. And that's high praise because he's an NFL back. And Bazelak, since he's come in from Missouri, has torched some defenses. So for Florida to put up that kind of defensive performance, like I fully expected them to, score a bunch of points on that Missouri defense that was going to be overworked. But for them to hold those two players to those averages per play, I was really impressed. So for me, if Florida wins this game, I don't know that they score more than the 29. It's somewhere in the 20s for me. If Florida wins this game, it's because their defense comes out and does more than I expect them to do. Is it the same for you, or is it something else?
Obviously, a team, when they win the game, wins it in every meaningful way. But I think the thing that would trigger it would be if Kyle Trask is able to dump the ball off enough, scramble enough. He's a good athlete, which gives man press teams a lot of issues, such that Georgia is limited in their ability to blitz him. If Trask's effective management of the offense reduces the blitz game, if he's good with his hot reads and whatnot, and can get the pressure off him, I think that's how Florida scores in the 30s, and that's what gives Florida a chance to win. I'm going to say one last thing, then I'll probably just let you close it out, as I think we're kind of wrapping up here. We said going into the season that I had Georgia as like a 7-3 team, and we got a lot of flack for it. And my entire rationale was I did not trust the quarterback situation. I think I've both been proven wrong and right on that. I think going into the season, maybe I was a little overzealous in how much that would affect a team. But if you saw where the situation was with Dwayne Mathis, you can understand that's what I thought was probably going to happen. And I could see Georgia being so crippled at the quarterback position that you can lose almost any game if you can't score more than 20 to 30, or especially if you can't score more than 20 points. And I think with Mathis at quarterback, that's what Georgia would have been doing. If you're a Georgia fan, you actually need to be really grateful, because in Stetson Bennett, you've got a guy that is allowing you to score more than 30 against reasonably good defenses. And yeah, he's limited, and yeah, he'll throw interceptions. I think you have to understand how close the season was to an absolute disaster when Newman opted out and when Daniels was unable to play. Because without Bennett on your roster, you would have been absolutely hamstrung offensively. And with him, you have a chance to beat almost any team in the country.
Yeah, and I think that the Auburn game is in play. I think the Kentucky game is in play. And look how that Arkansas game started out. I mean, because you look at where it was at halftime before Bennett came in, that game was clearly in play. So this goes back to what we said in the summer, and it keeps proving out throughout this year more than ever. You're not going to win a national championship without elite quarterback play, because quarterback play is so dang important. And does that mean that maybe Georgia isn't going to win a national championship this year? Probably not, though I do think they still control their own destiny getting the playoffs. Probably not going to win a national championship because they don't have elite quarterback play, but like you said, good quarterback play versus what they could have had has turned them from a potential disaster season to a season that's going to be good enough that it's not going to hamper recruiting, that they might have another division title and all of that. So I'm glad you made that point. All right, y'all, that's it for us. Remember, in the comments, give us your score prediction. We're pretty curious about what y'all think about this game, given that the models got it pretty close. You can also throw shade at our model. This is the first time we've seen it this year, so you can give us your thoughts on where the model's at on this. Let us know what you think. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.